Are you currently doing or considering running hybrid meetings? I know that when the world changed, many of us were pushed onto virtual only. That was a huge adaptation for most of us. And now that more people are returning to traditional workplaces and offices, we're starting to think about what is the future of meetings. So today we're going to ask the question, is hybrid the future of our meetings? Are we going to try and bring some of the things that we learned about the virtual world and put those together with a traditional in-person meeting? Well, there's a lot to consider, and I am so fortunate because today we have a special guest. But if you are brand new, you've never met me before, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Kat, and I help people to create more professional and engaging online presentations. Now, our guest is a fellow facilitator and really cares about the experience of people showing up together, joining for a meeting. So I am thrilled that we have our guest, KECK. Now, Jan and I were on a panel together and this topic came up. So people wanted to know about hybrid meetings. They wanted the opinion and how do you do it well? What's the technology? And they were kind of jumping to the technology without necessarily considering all of the things that have to come together. And both Jan and I definitely had some opinions, very strong opinions about hybrid. So we thought it would be wonderful to get together and have a conversation about hybrid meetings. So if you would like to introduce yourself, let the group know a little bit about you.
Sure. I'm really excited to chat about hybrid because yes, same as you, a lot of the people in my community have been asking me about this, especially since beginning of COVID, I decided to really jump in both feet first into the digital world. Before COVID, most of my experiences, workshops that I created were focused on how can we have more meaningful conversations? How can we get beyond small talk? And one of the first things we usually do is use this, which is a cell phone sleeping bag, but actually it's just a padded envelope that we put our cell phones in. So we can remove the technology from connecting with each other because I feel like that constant buzzing in your pocket is a big distraction. But then with COVID, that wasn't really possible anymore. So we had to figure out how to use this and our computers in a more meaningful way. So that's what my work has been for the last year and a half, is figuring out how can we have more meaningful interactions, meaningful gatherings using technology.
And so because you focus on this and you focus on the experience and meaningful interactions, did you notice that suddenly people started to come to you and ask questions about hybrid meetings and how to do that well?
Definitely. I actually think that once I started to understand what hybrid meeting actually is, uh, I often say that everybody was part of an accidental hybrid meeting. Like you probably were part of one, but you didn't even notice
Oh, that's a
because,
great idea. A great
um,
point. I really like that.
yeah. And I think, Kat, you have a story of just like if one person calls in from a phone into a meeting, like you're having a hybrid meeting.
Yes.
Same thing the other way around. And I've had this happen to me many times. Again, going virtual, two people sitting in the same room or in front of one device. Again, you're having a hybrid meeting.
Mm-hmm.
So there's lots of different types of hybrid that I think everybody's been part of one at least,
Yeah.
but you might not even have noticed it.
I think that's a really great point that they have been around for a very long time. When someone was traveling or another person on the team had to be elsewhere, they would find ways to bring them in. I know I used to be on a university board of governors, and we often had members calling in. We had to make sure that we had the phone set up and the teleconferencing information. And then later it developed with a little bit more technology. And so they were coming in on screens. So we've been working on it for a while, but it's been a little rough. Now, before we get into our discussion, I would love us to clarify, what do we mean when we say hybrid meeting? And I think, Jan, you have some visuals that I would love for you to share with the audience.
Yeah, so like I said, there's a big spectrum, and I actually created this little drawing just this morning where maybe we can see what does the spectrum look like, because I think what most people think about when they think of hybrid is, oh, wrong, wrong button. The thing right in the middle, right? Like half of the people are online and half of the people are there in person together in the same room. That's, I think, what most people think about. But it's also a hybrid meeting if everybody's online, but then there's two people sitting in the same room. That would be all the way on the left side of the spectrum. And if we go all the way on the right, it would mean you have a in-person meeting where everybody's there except that one person who's calling in or joining from a computer. So I think for today, what mostly we're going to be talking about is the idea of you have people in person, on site, and you have people online, and they are having a meeting at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. So we definitely in got to come back on the screen. So we are talking about that combination, and what are some of the things that you have to think about, especially if you are designing this. And I think Jan will agree with me on this, but it is a lot more work than most people would expect. And if you thought virtual meetings were taking a lot of mental effort to run, then I mean, this is just taking it up a notch. It's like turning it to 11. Would you agree with that?
Definitely. Like I like to think of that you're, instead of creating one meeting, you're creating three. Like you're creating a virtual one, you're creating one in person, and you're trying to get this overlap happening where
Yeah.
people in person and people who are virtual actually connect with each other and have like a shared experience.
Yeah. And you have
But
you I think you have a
yeah,
diagram, right? Let's take a look at this. I like this way of thinking about it because it's visual and it kind of brings in these two different types of meetings together.
right. So we have the online experience that we're creating, and a lot of us, Kat, you and me, have been doing this for a long time since the beginning of COVID, and the on-site, the in-person, which has happened before. But now, if you're doing hybrid, you also have to consider that part in the middle. And Kat and me were chatting earlier. Yes, it looks like a small part where that overlap is, but that's really where designing experience comes in. Like for some experiences, that overlap will be quite small, but I think if you can make it bigger, so more of your participants, more of the people who attend can have this shared experience, the better. But it's also the most challenging part to create.
Yeah. So it might be a small part of the pie, but I maybe you can consider it really concentrated, that like that is where you need to focus a lot of your attention. You don't want to completely drop the online and the on-site experience. You want to make sure those happen. But if you're not thinking about how those two play together, then you could be in deep trouble. And something that I really, really strongly believe is that if you are going to be running a hybrid meeting and or helping to plan one, you have to have experienced being on both sides of that. And this comes from personal experience. I have mentioned this before a couple of times when I was asked about hybrid meetings, but I used to work on a university campus where there were multiple locations. And so on several occasions, we would have meetings and we had video conferencing set up across the different campuses. When I was in the larger campus and there were more of us in the room and maybe only a couple of people in the other campus, it really turned into most of the people, the larger room was having most of the conversation and occasionally remembering that there were other people on a screen, inviting them to come in. And when I was on the smaller campus and I would take part as the minority, really, there's just a few of us, and we would be basically watching a larger meeting take place and really feeling like we're on the outside. Similarly, if you've ever called into a meeting, like we mentioned before, you might notice some things that you never would have thought of if you're in the room. And a really great example from my past board experience is that when you call into a meeting, if the microphone picking up all the voices is sitting near somebody's work area, if they are flipping pages that they printed or moving their drink around, typing a keyboard, that microphone is picking that up a lot more than it's picking up the voices. So it can be a really frustrating experience to be on that other side. So that to me is a really important part of, if you are going to plan, if you're going to be part of this, to really understand what the experience is like.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's the accidental hybrids where there's not a lot of planning that goes into it, because, and again, this has happened to me where a client hired me to do it was actually exactly a year ago, a company holiday, virtual holiday event. And I did not know this, that they ended up having a few people basically share a computer, and you had to adjust on the fly, and the experience was not as great
Yeah.
because as soon as one person unmutes themselves and all the speakers start going off, you get this crazy feedback. And I think that audio issue with hybrid,
Yeah.
when there's people at the same room, is maybe one of the biggest ones to solve. Like if you are not prepared, or have thought about this, like
Mhm.
where does the microphone go so the
Yeah.
people who are not in person can hear everyone, but also which speaker is actually going to bring the audio back in so you can hear the people who are speaking who are not there.
I really like that. And I would love to know, I see there's a couple of people who are here live with us today. I see Benjamin has experience with this. Is there anything that you have learned? I'd love to hear from you either in the chat or the comments of what are some of the things you've discovered or uncovered as you start to run these meetings? And I think that's a really great example. Even if you think about if you've ever seen a couple or people who live in the same house, either be on a live stream or maybe in an audio only environment like Clubhouse or Twitter Spaces, they have to be in completely separate rooms in order to have that conversation. So in certain aspects, and from the technology standpoint, it's actually a disadvantage to be in the same room when people are participating on the computer. And I think you had mentioned that you had some thoughts around that tech side. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on what are the tech considerations for how you can manage these things, like feedback on microphones for picking up, that echo cancellation and all those fun things to think about.
Right. I like in my work, I talk a lot about how can we make sure that people feel seen and heard.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean that sometimes in the metaphorical level, like sharing something and being acknowledged for what you shared. But in this case, it's the literal definition of being seen and heard.
Yeah.
Like if you are in person, you need to make sure that you can see the people who are virtual. So having maybe a big monitor in your meeting room so you can see everyone, or everyone with their own laptop or device so they can see who is online. And how can you hear them? So does everybody have earbuds? Is there one big speaker that is loud enough so you can hear it wherever you are in the room? And then going the other direction, like for the people who are virtual, how can they see all the people who are in the room? Like if the camera is at the front, let's say in a boardroom, and the camera's in the front, they will not see the people who are sitting in the back.
Yep.
Same thing, like are they able to hear? If the microphone is at the front of the room, they will only be able to hear the person who's close to the microphone. So I often like to think of um, either one of the easiest ways is almost to create a stage. Like if you are in person, you want to speak, you have to walk to the front of the room, and that's where the camera and the microphone is set up so people can hear you in person and online.
Oh, okay.
Um, so that's like one solution, but there's lots of different ones depending on also the setup and what you want to do.
So, yeah, I think one of the big things around this is if you are working with an organization or you are going to be intending to have hybrid meetings as part of a regular aspect of your business, there is going to be the investment required to do it well and to do it right. And that will mean taking into consideration microphones, echo cancellation, feedback. I see one of the comments in here is one of the trickiest things is muting everyone to try and keep the noise out, but you also want to have engagement. I think that's a really great point. And this obviously happens in virtual only, but for hybrid as well, I think, and actually this is maybe where it's a really good chance to pause and reflect on the reason people are enthusiastic about getting back to some form of in-person is that they miss the benefits that you have from an in-person meeting that are stripped away in those virtual environments. And one of them is this instantaneous feedback. We see from someone's face, we hear cues a little bit faster. There isn't this delay. When we're on the computer, even right now, our conversation would be a lot more fluid if we were just recording the two of us having a conversation in person versus that slight delay, checking, okay, are they done speaking? Is it my turn to speak? Whereas in person, it can be a little bit more natural. And that's, I think, the excitement of getting back to in person. But as soon as you add in the virtual, you've now, like, there's going to be a delay. You cannot avoid that if there's any virtual aspect to that meeting. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I actually think that, and this is my biggest issue with hybrid, and I'll probably share pretty soon that I'm not a huge fan of doing hybrid meetings at all, because what I always like to think of, I said this at the beginning, I like to invite participants to turn off their phones because it's a distraction. Like if you've ever been, let's say, at a coffee shop or you're meeting with a friend and you're telling this really maybe even vulnerable story with them, or you're sharing a challenge that you're having, and they get a text, their phone buzzes and they pick it up, and while you're talking, they're texting and they're not really listening, like it makes you feel invisible, unimportant, ignored. And if we're asking people to meet in person and have a device or also pay attention to what's happening online, means that they're not ever going to really be present with each other in person either. So you're constantly distracted in a way. And I really like to think of, and this is maybe the first question everybody needs to ask themselves, like, what's the purpose for this meeting? Why are we gathering?
Mm-hmm.
And then decide, does this make sense to do it all virtual? And
Yeah.
I would actually say that oftentimes having everyone virtual will be way easier than doing some form of hybrid if it's not necessary for the people to be in person in the same room together.
Mm-hmm. I think that's I think all of us would probably agree. We would love for people to be more intentional when planning meetings, of saying, do we really need to have this as a meeting? And then I think now we are faced with that. Just because some people happen to be in the same geographical location does not necessarily mean that the best version would be hybrid, and that maybe everyone just stays at their desk and joins a virtual meeting if part of the participants are joining virtually, versus the amount of work to run it well. And so I would say the other thing that I would really like to emphasize, and I'd like to come to some of these, there's some great comments in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that I think is really important is the amount of effort. And as you said, there's intention. But if you are going to run a hybrid meeting, I feel like there should be at least one person who is sort of assigned in that moderation role who is not the lead of the meeting. So whoever's leading the meeting, doing the most speaking, or even moderating verbally, there should be a second person or maybe a third who are helping out with making sure that everyone is being seen. As you said, being seen, being heard, because I think it's very easy for your virtual participants, and maybe in some cases, if there's only a couple people in a room together, they might have a similar experience. They might feel invisible. And when that happens, people disengage. They'll pick up their phone, they'll check their email, they'll just say, like, why am I even here? I'm invisible. And we want people to feel seen, we want them to feel heard, and that they are part of that. And that takes a lot of intention and a lot of work. And I think there should be a dedicated person who is responsible for making sure that there's a balance and a flow of conversation between the participants.
Yeah, like I don't think any one person can effectively run what is like 2 to 3 meetings simultaneously, right? Mm-hmm. Like if you have a person who is your co-facilitator, your co-host, your co-moderator, who can be in person if you're virtual, or can be virtual if you're in person, to just make sure that if there's a message in the chat from the virtual participants, it doesn't get ignored. Because yes. I think that's the accidental hybrid meetings that I've been part of. It was designed for in person, and people are like, they're using Post-its and writing things on papers and put them on the flip chart. Nobody can see what's on the flip chart. And then if people ask in the chat, hey, I can't see that, and there's not a person to check the chat, mm-hmm. they will not be able to even participate or hear what's going on in the meeting.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you have this extra person that can be like the in-person and virtual co-host, they need to have this extra line of communication.
Yeah.
So they can reach each other and make them aware that one part of the attendees is not fully participating.
Well, and I think there's human error, and the fact that, when I would be in these multi-location meetings where we would have the camera at the front of the room, the screen at the front of the room. And then so if you were ever presenting, you kind of had to figure out, okay, do I sit sort of towards the front and facing here and turn and look at the people? As a human, you're just primed to look at other faces. And if you're in a room with faces, you are going to prioritize those faces over a camera lens, which is you looking at the people on the other side. Because that's the other part, which I think we both experienced this. We're fans of looking into the camera to show that you're making eye contact and that you are speaking to that person. But in those setups, mostly you're looking at a screen, so you're never really making eye contact as well. So that problem still exists. And I think having that person who's responsible for paying attention to the success of that meeting might be able to tell a speaker, hey, make sure that your back is actually to the camera right now, or hey, make sure that you are treating the camera like a room full of people as well. And yeah, it's tricky.
Yeah. Maybe I can share one example of
Yeah.
a hybrid experience that I helped put together that I think worked perfectly. And this might not be your typical meeting. It actually was a hybrid wedding. But there's lots of lessons I think we can learn from how we thought about designing that and how can that be applied to, let's say, the workplace. But from the beginning, we knew that what's happening in person, people who are joining virtually, they will always miss out. Like in person, they have the reception, there's a dinner, people can't have the food, they're not going to ship food, and people eating in front of their screens, it's not the same as sitting in the room with people. So we decided that we'll create a separate online experience for everyone who couldn't be there in person. And actually was great because the guests came from Hungary and Brazil and Canada. So a lot more people were able to attend the whole wedding by being able to join virtually. But my job for the virtual experience was, we're going to do breakout rooms. We're going to run activities so they can connect with each other. We created a collaborative art piece where everybody drew something that they wished the couple for the future. But even for that, people in person could just scan a QR code and also participate.
Okay.
And then for the actual day, we actually had a reporter on the scene. So we kind of treated it like a TV show where one person created programming for the virtual audience where he interviewed the wedding party. So I was running an activity, then he would find someone, interview them. I would run an activity while he finds the next person. And we created this almost TV show like broadcast for the virtual experience until the ceremony started. And that's where everybody had the same experience of watching the couple. And then after that, the couple had a couple of minutes to do a game where they interacted with the virtual participants. So they also could get some quality time with them. And then after that, the virtual experience ended and they continued with the in-person one. Mm-hmm. And I think that idea of, we created something for virtual, there was something that is kind of already happening in person, and we created that little overlap in the middle.
Yeah. So the thing I love about that story is that there is such attention to both groups, so not neglecting either. And how do you bring those across? So the example of having something that is actually primarily more virtual, but you're inviting the in-person guests to participate and take part with their mobile device, but then also making sure that the people who are home feel like they're there and having that interview style, the reporter. I think those are really nice touches that make the person watching the virtual wedding feel like they matter and that the bride and groom care that they are part of this, and they actually feel like part of it, not just kind of a voyeur sitting and just watching the stream. So I really like that example. And I think you can translate that to a lot of other circumstances where, even if it's not a wedding, maybe it's not quite as exciting, but for other hybrid events where you have some in-person and some virtual, how are you making both of those parties feel like they are an active participant? And how do you bridge both of those I guess not technologies, but yeah, how are you having the in-person people participate with some of the virtual only? And I think someone had mentioned here, I have to go back, there's some great conversation going on in the chat around, you need to level the playing field. So Carolyn says, it's a lot about how you value remote participants. If you design an in-room process like flip charting or sticky notes that virtual folks can't participate, you need to level the playing field. I think that's a really great way to think of it. How do we make sure that every single person can participate? And if they cannot all participate, we're not doing it. Like, that's just, don't do it. If you're going to exclude people, that should not be part of that experience. So I think, yeah, having everyone
Especially,
use a virtual
yeah,
tool or something like that. Yeah.
especially when maybe the reason why somebody is not there in person is not something that they can control,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like
Yeah.
excluding people for not, I don't know, being able to fly in for a meeting because they're on the other side of the world is not that great in terms of inclusivity
Mm-hmm.
and creating an experience that you want to be meaningful for everyone.
Yeah. I completely agree. And now, is there anything, Jan, that you're seeing in the chat that you wanted to come back to? I just want to take a quick look because there's so many things here. You know, Reed is saying it's so important to respect the time of virtual attendees. I was on a recent hybrid meeting where the start time was noted at 9, logged in, and they said 9:30 so people could chat and grab food. That's a great example of how the person running that was not considerate of the folks who were joining virtually. Now, if you had said in advance, we're going to have sort of a, coffee and chat, maybe have a breakout room for the virtual participants to bring a coffee and chat if they want to, because that is another aspect that did get lost when we started to all meet virtually. There used to be, I can't remember there's a technical term for it, but those casual interactions as you were gathering in a room or at the end of a meeting as you're walking out, you can have those side conversation. Hey, how was your weekend? Or hey, what did you think of that? Oh yeah, what are those? Those get lost when we don't have the ability to have those chats. So I think if we take that example, sure, you could have the people in person chat and grab food, but you need to make sure that the people online have that same opportunity, or that it's very clear that the actual meeting is not starting until 9:30. That's when you need to be online. Prior to that, we have the option of a chat. Like if you want to join, show up a few minutes early, talk to some of the other people who are going to be joining the meeting. That to me is like thinking a little bit more about the people attending virtually.
Yeah, like that's the one thing I've been saying for like the last year and a little bit. Online, these authentic human connections,
Mm-hmm.
like to call them magical human moments, don't happen by accident. You actually have to design for them
Right.
because, like you said, there is no lineup while you're entering a venue where you can chat with the people next to you, or uh, actually lineups in general to me are the things that we lost, and there's so much magic that happens, I don't know, waiting to use the restroom, waiting to get a coffee, waiting to get food,
Mm-hmm.
the idea of sharing food and sitting around a table. So online I always say, like, we have to design for that. Like, what are the activities that we can create so these magical human moments happen more often? And one easy one is actually sometimes I recreate this kind of waiting in line by, as soon as people come in, I put them in a breakout room with 3-4 people,
Yeah.
with ideally some conversation starters, just to speed up the whole connection process and not leaving them talking about the weather and sports and other things that are not that interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And every time like the next 4 or 5 people come in, I put them in a new breakout room. So this way they can have their experience before the actual event starts.
Yeah. I love the idea of facilitating those, and I as you were describing waiting in line, which of course all of us think, oh, I'm so glad I'm not waiting in line, but they're not necessarily thinking about the unintended benefits of that. But I had a flashback to an event that I attended by myself. It was a local in-person event a few years ago for entrepreneurs. I knew no one. They had, little fruit and croissants and coffee, so you could kind of pick it up. And I just sat down, and I just didn't have, the people running the meeting weren't necessarily thinking of ways to initiate, or, here's your paper, find out the name of the person beside you, something really simple that can help people engage. There are ways that people could be doing that in person that got missed, because I think I don't want to show up too early if I don't know anyone there. But if the person running that meeting is thinking about ways for them to connect, that's really helpful. And in that virtual environment, I like that example you gave of putting a few people together in a room, but having something that starts a conversation. And I think the more we can get better at, I like to call them, I think someone used this once on a podcast and I really liked it, the idea of, I can't help it, conversation starter. So,
Mm-hmm.
a simple example, and it could be timely, like, Christmas music before or after December 1st or something like that. People have opinions on different things and they're sort of funny and silly. and usually someone can kind of chime in, or I mean, maybe that's not the best example, but it's better than just throwing people in the room and expecting them to start talking to each other. That can just be deer in a headlights situation.
It's my worst nightmare. Like unfacilitated networking events or cocktail parties, like I avoid at all costs now,
Yeah.
because that's where you usually just have the same conversation 20 times. So what do? You walk away with a stack of business cards, but you haven't really met anyone.
Mm-hmm.
That's at least been my experience. So I'm a huge fan of in-person and virtual facilitated activities. And um, I like to think of it as the unofficial start activity, like
Yeah.
before everyone has arrived. And this happens at meetings, at social events. There is a spectrum, a few minutes of when people join the Zoom link. Like if you have, and maybe this is like another issue about meetings in general in the virtual space now, everything's back to back. Like your one meeting ends at the top of the hour, the next meeting starts exactly at the same time because they think, oh, you just have to click this link and you can join. But when do people go to use the washroom? When do
Mm-hmm.
they refill their water? There's no time for that so often. And then you go over like 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So there's always this time in the beginning where it can be the most awkward thing. Like I often like to say the worst thing a facilitator or host could say, let's just wait until everybody has arrived, because you're
Yeah.
basically penalizing the people who showed up on time. You're setting
Yes.
expectations that you never start on time. And the worst thing, you're allowing everyone to disengage, check their phone, do something else, turn
Mm-hmm.
off their camera rather than asking to engage right away.
Yeah.
And it'll be really hard to get them re-engaged after. So thinking of a simple question that you can ask in the chat, or in person, I often would do name tags, and the name tag itself had a question or a topic on it that people could fill out. So right away, you have this conversation starter to get into something meaningful.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I have my question for you is, let's say someone comes to you and they say, okay, I have to run a hybrid meeting. This does have to be a meeting. We're going to have a group of people on site. We're going to have a group of people joining. What is maybe the first three things you say to them to run a successful hybrid event?
The first thing I would want to find out is like how many people are online, how many people are going to show up in person.
Mm-hmm.
Because I would always start by designing the experience for the minority. Like if there's two people in person and everybody else is virtual, I would probably start with, okay, how can I make sure that those two in-person participants are engaged and can fully participate?
Yes.
And then figure out what do we do in a virtual way to make sure that they can do it too. And if it's the other way around, then I would start with the virtual experience first.
Mm-hmm.
So asking like, what's the split? Like what type of hybrid are we actually talking about on this
Yeah.
spectrum?
I really like that. Plan for the minority. So whatever's the smaller group, make sure that you're paying attention to that, because that's likely to get lost in the planning.
Yeah, and with that in mind, also, like if you are part of the majority, then even more so, like having, like depending on who it is that I'm talking to, is there a budget to hire a co-facilitator, co-host? Because
Mm-hmm.
that would be really important. Or is there somebody in the team that would take up that role?
Yeah.
Like one of the other ideas that I've heard, I haven't tried myself, was the idea of having a buddy system. Like if you'd have almost like equal split, having each in-person participant have a buddy that is virtual that they can chat with and have like a separate chat channel
Ah,
to make
okay.
sure that everybody can stay engaged and can communicate with the other group.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then I guess the third one would be around the technology.
Yes.
Like especially what does the in-person room setup look like?
Mm-hmm.
And making sure that that is tested before the meeting, before you're asking people to use it.
Yes. That's a really great reminder. Is run a test meeting, get a few people together, go through and actually see if the tech works, have more than one person, check your mics, check your speakers. And then I think I would also add, depending on the type of meeting, if it makes more sense in the design of the meeting to have each in-person participant have a screen in front of them, whether that's a tablet, computer, etc., make sure that that's you're investing in that. don't just expect everyone to have the right technology. So if you're setting up a meeting and you're investing in doing this properly, make sure that the room is arranged so no matter who shows up, they can be part of this meeting, and that you're not depending on their tech in order to do this.
And there are some great like conference style microphones now that pick up a lot from, like, if people sitting around a table, having that in the middle, it will pick up from all directions. So there is some great technology out there that probably makes sense to invest in if you're doing this on a regular basis.
Yeah, I've seen some. I know there's one called the Owl, and it has the camera that moves around and it will identify who's speaking and make sure that. So there, I think the good news is that many companies recognize that this is happening, whether we like it or not. And they are trying to use some of the intelligence that we have and these features that we're able to do now that we maybe weren't able to do even a few years ago, and bring that into the experience. So I think exploring those, but talking to people who've done this. And that's one of the reasons that I've sort of hesitated when people said, hey, what's your advice on hybrid meetings? And aside from the fact that, yes, I have some experience as a participant and things that I am aware of because of those experiences, you really do want to talk to someone who has run some events, who has hands-on experience, so they know what are the common pitfalls, what are the things that they're going to come up against. And at first you might feel inclined to cut corners and try and save money, but I think this is the type of thing that does require some investment to do it well and to be meaningful.
Yeah. Like, I'm curious if I can ask a question back. What have you noticed, or what are you worried about might be the biggest mistakes that people make if they don't plan ahead? Like, if they're doing their first hybrid meeting, what is something that they probably will forget to think about?
I think that it's just they go on autopilot and just completely, they're just not thinking about the experience of everyone who is there. And at least that's my experience from those past meetings, where it's basically human error. They just started paying attention to the people, or if they were online, just kind of focusing on that and forgetting about that minority that you mentioned and not using another person. And I think as we have this conversation, really it'd be ideal to have sort of a moderator co-host on the virtual platform and one in the room, so that they're both, and those two can kind of be partners who are making sure that this is running smoothly and that we're addressing any of the concerns or needs of the respective participants. I mean, on a really small scale, that might not be as necessary, but yeah, I really feel like, I think earlier on today, I said that I recommend anyone planning a meeting be on both sides. I actually think every single person as a participant should have to be on both sides, because that will make you a more considerate participant as well. If you have experienced being in the minority group, being in the majority group, being online versus being in person, once you've experienced that, you can have a lot more empathy for the person who has the more demanding experience. I would say. I don't know if that's the right term, but that's the term that is coming to mind as I think of this right now.
Yeah, it's definitely about building a bit of empathy, right? Like, if you are a participant, and I think I always like to give a lot of responsibility to my participants. If you can teach the group to facilitate that by themselves, especially if you're just one person, you're going to have way more engaged meeting by the end of it.
Excellent. So I'm gonna wrap things up, but I do want to offer one more opportunity. Jan, what would be your words of wisdom as we sort of wrap up this initial discussion on hybrid meetings and what people should be thinking about? What's something you want to leave our audience with?
I think the biggest question is, start with the purpose of why you're bringing people together. And once you figure that out, decide, does this have to be virtual or in person? And only then, if it can't be one or the other, then start thinking about a hybrid meeting. If you're having a dinner party, I don't think anybody has enjoyed a dinner party as much sitting in front of your computer and eating and watching other people eat and hear the sounds through the microphone much louder than you would in person. So this is something that has to be, in my opinion, in person. And if you're just sharing a slideshow and you're doing a presentation, why do we ask people to drive to the office and sit in the room? So I think a lot of it starts with what's the purpose of the meeting, and then you can figure out how to make that work.
Yeah. I like that you brought up that the dinner party example. While it might seem silly, because of our situation over the last 20 months, we have been really creative with trying to have people participate and engage in experiences using virtual, setting up a phone, etc. But there are certain occasions where just because you can bring someone in through a computer does not mean that you should. And there are just certain experiences that should probably be reserved for in-person only. And then there are experiences that right now might be more enjoyable in that virtual only format. So being realistic and not just because you can doesn't mean that you should. Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. And did you want to share? I know I have. Would you like to show your website? I may have pulled it up. Do you you want to
Sure.
tell a little bit about where can people find you? What do you do? And a little bit more about how they can follow you, find you, etc.
Yeah. So my website is jankeck.com, which Kat has graciously pulled up. Let's have a conversation that matters. That's really what I'm all about. My intention often when creating an experience, when training other people how to create experiences, is how can we make sure that people feel less alone by the end of it? And two of the main things that I can offer if you're on my website are the connection cards, which is a physical deck of cards. So it's not digital. Like you can get a PDF as well, but I highly recommend the physical one. That sparks some more interesting conversations. And then I do a 5-week virtual facilitator training where I actually talk about how can we do some of those things, those magical human moments, how we can recreate them in a virtual space, let's say on Zoom or other digital meeting platforms.
I love that. And I really think check out, just go and have a look at Jan's page. I just think this idea, it doesn't come naturally to everyone. Even me, these things don't come naturally. So when people are really strong and excel at creating these incredible experiences, thinking about what people are actually going through when they join you and participate in something, that really does elevate an experience, but it does take some intention and some foresight. And so working with someone like Jan who can help you with that is definitely the way to go. So thank you so much. We're going to wrap up, and I just appreciate you being here. And for anyone trying hybrid meetings, let us know how they go. Come back, share in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. All right. Thanks so much.